All right, fantasy football fanatics, welcome back. We're diving deep into Game Week 14, reliving the highs and lows, and then we'll take a peek ahead at what Game Week 15 has in store for all of us.
It really is remarkable how much can change in just 1 week, isn't it?
Oh, tell me about it. I mean, 1 minute you think you've got it all figured out, and then bam, injuries, upsets, surprise performances. It's what keeps us coming back for more, though, right?
Absolutely. That unpredictable element is part of the thrill. And speaking of curveballs, did you see that Newcastle-Liverpool draw? Talk about a shakeup for some fantasy managers.
I know, right? It really threw a wrench in some plans, especially for anyone involved in that trade proposal flying around. Liverpool's Curtis Jones and Koeman Kelleher from Sells and Brendan Johnson.
Ah, yes, that trade offer.
Big decision there for Alfred Zarifa. He ended up declining it.
He did. Which raises the question, was that the right call? I mean, holding on to Sells and Johnson, those players have got potential for sure.
Yeah. But on the other hand, Jones and Kelleher just came off a pretty strong performance against a tough Newcastle side. What do you think? Short-term points grab or long-term investment? Tough call.
Well, it all boils down to Alfred's overall strategy, doesn't it? Is he playing for immediate gains, or is he in it for the long haul? Only time will tell.
That's the beauty of fantasy football, right?
Oh.
Every decision has these ripple effects.
Okay.
But let's move on to some good news, shall we? Let's talk about those standout performers from Game Week 14. I bet some of our listeners out there had some serious point scorers on their teams.
Oh, for sure. We saw some incredible performances. Players absolutely racking up the points with their fantastic form and those sky-high influence, creativity, and threat scores.
Hold on. For those of us who might not be as familiar with the finer points, can you break down what those scores actually mean and how they translate into fantasy points?
Sure thing. So these metrics, they essentially measure how involved a player is in their team's attacking play. Influence, that's all about those actions leading up to goals, like key passes, shots that force a save, things like that. Creativity is more about those passes that directly set up scoring chances, think assists or through balls. And then you've got threat, which really quantifies how likely a player is to score based on, the number of shots they're taking, where they're shooting from, the type of shot.
So basically, if you've got a player with high scores across all three categories, they're probably a fantasy football dream.
You got it. They're the ones driving their team's attack, and that often means big fantasy points.
All right, I'm sure some of our listeners are doing a little happy dance right now, thinking about those points.
Hopefully. But before we get too excited about the next game week, we have to address the dreaded I word. You know the one.
Oh, no, not injuries. Nobody wants to hear about injuries.
I know, it's a bummer, but ignoring them won't make them go away. And we've got some big ones to report this week that could really shake things up. Alex Scott, Marcus Senesi, and Matthias Jensen are all sidelined. That leaves some pretty big holes in their respective teams.
And probably in some fantasy lineups, too. Ouch, that's got to sting. Now, what about Jacob Ramsey? Any updates on his hamstring injury? When can we expect him back?
Looks like it's gonna be a while. Unfortunately, the latest word is he's out till December 21st.
That's a tough break. So managers will need to find a temporary replacement. December injuries always seem to throw a wrench in the works. And what's the latest on John Stones and Amadou Onana? I know a lot of fantasy managers are anxiously awaiting news on those foot injuries.
Yeah, those are tricky ones. From what we're hearing, Onana could be back as early as December 14th. Stones might be back on the pitch by the 15th. But it's cutting it close, isn't it? Game week 15 is right around the corner.
Right. Talk about a nail biter. I mean, do you hold on, or do you start looking for replacements? What do you do?
It's all about weighing those risks and rewards, right? Do you think they'll make a big enough impact when they return to justify holding on? Tough decisions. Tough decisions. But hey, maybe this opens up an opportunity for someone else to step up, right? Someone on your bench, someone you can bring in from the transfer market.
Yeah, you got to look for that silver lining. Every cloud has one, right? Now, let's shift gears and talk about the main event, shall we? Game week 15.
Oh yes, the games to come. Let's take a look at those fixtures. I think things are about to get very interesting for certain fantasy managers.
Okay, give us a taste. What are we looking at?
Well, I think we should talk about some of those intriguing matchups on the horizon. We've got folks like Silliman, Barhoma, Raid, Andrew Gurgis, Mokaji, John Philip Khalil, Andrew Boutros, David Gurgis, Alfred Zarifa, and Mark Carollos, all eagerly waiting to see what unfolds.
All right, I'm intrigued. But hold on, before we go any further, we can't forget about those players who are still recovering.
You're right. Injuries and suspensions, they're always a factor. We've got Kieran Trippier potentially returning for Newcastle on December 7th. That could be a big boost for some managers. But then you've got Tom Kearney. He's suspended until December 22nd, and Sasa Lukic is out until December 8th. That's got to sting.
It's a constant game of adjustments, isn't it? Fantasy football keeps us on our toes. But isn't that part of the fun?
Absolutely. The challenge, the strategy, it's all part of the appeal.
So you ready to dive into some team-specific insights? Maybe uncover some hidden fantasy gems?
Oh, I'm always ready for a good treasure hunt. Let's do it.
Okay, let's start with Andrew Gurgis, who's been keeping an eye on a certain Newcastle defender. He might be particularly interested in that Trippier news. Trippier's return could be huge, but Gurgis shouldn't assume he'll automatically be back in the starting lineup. You know, Newcastle's defense has actually been pretty solid without him. Yeah, you're right. Good point. And that's a key reminder for all of us fantasy managers, right? It doesn't matter how good a player is on paper if they're not actually getting minutes on the pitch. They're not earning us those sweet, sweet points.
Exactly. Minutes are king in fantasy football, no doubt about it. So Gurgis really needs to think about the risk involved there. Is it worth it to bring in a player who might not even play the full 90 minutes?
Decisions, right?
Yeah.
Speaking of tough calls, let's talk about Alfred Zarifa. He's not afraid to make a bold move or two in the transfer market. Any insights for him based on what we're seeing in the data?
Well, there's this one striker, plays for a mid-table team, hasn't been getting a lot of attention, but his underlying stats, really promising, and he's got a pretty favorable matchup coming up against a defense that's, well, let's just say they've been a bit leaky lately.
Ooh, now that sounds like it could be right up Alfred's alley. But even with a good matchup, is there anything specific in the data that really makes you think this striker is a smart pick for him?
Yeah, if you look at his shot map, it paints a pretty clear picture. He's taking high-quality shots from dangerous positions, and his team's attack as a whole has been creating more and more scoring opportunities for him.
So does Alfred stick with his current lineup, or does he roll the dice on this under-the-radar striker? Another one of those classic fantasy football dilemmas.
It is, and that's what keeps things exciting. Now, how about John Philip Khalil? I know he's always on the lookout for a bargain midfielder. Any hidden gems out there for him?
John Phillip loves those hidden gems, those differential picks that give him that extra edge. What do you think?
Well, I think Brighton's game against Crystal Palace next week could be interesting. Palace have been a bit shaky defensively, and a player like Pascal Gross, who's been showing some decent form lately, might be worth considering.
Gross, yeah. He's a good shout. He's not going to grab headlines, but he could be a solid under-the-radar pick that helps John Phillip climb the ranks.
Exactly. Sometimes it's those unheralded players that make all the difference.
Okay, so we've got some potential transfer targets for Alfred and John Phillip. What about some general lineup advice for Game Week 15? Any must-start players? Any matchups that just scream, play me?
There's this one midfielder I've got my eye on. He's up against a team with a historically weak defense. It's a dream scenario for fantasy managers.
All right, you've got to give us a little more than that. Who is this mystery midfielder?
I don't want to spoil the surprise, but let's just say he's been in red-hot form, and his team's attacking style should really exploit this matchup.
Okay, I'll bite. I guess our listeners will have to do a little digging themselves. But hey, that's part of the fun, right?
Absolutely. And let's be real, even with the best research and the most favorable matchups, there's always an element of unpredictability in fantasy football. That's what keeps us coming back for more.
It's a roller coaster ride, that's for sure. Now, before we wrap up, I want to touch on something that I think is really important, especially after seeing how these injuries can completely change the game. What about bench depth? How are you approaching that for the rest of the season?
Ah, yes, the bench. Those unsung heroes of our fantasy squads. It's a tough balance to strike, isn't it? You want players who can step up if needed, but you don't want to waste valuable roster spots on players who are just going to sit there and collect dust.
So what's the secret? Do you prioritize those reliable backups, or do you take a gamble on those high upside, high risk players?
I think it really depends on a couple of things. Your risk tolerance, and how confident you are in your starting 11. If you've got a solid core of players, those guys who are consistently putting up points, then you might have a bit more flexibility to take a chance on a bench player who has a higher ceiling, even if they might not play as much.
It makes sense. It's about tailoring your approach to your specific situation.
Yeah.
Right? So someone like Mark Carollos, who likes to play it, say, a reliable backup strategy probably makes more sense. But for someone like David Gurgis, who loves a good gamble, maybe those high upside players are more appealing.
Precisely. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to fantasy football. It's about finding what works best for you and then sticking to your guns.
Yeah, I like that, sticking to your guns. It's like building a puzzle, right? You need all the right pieces to fit together to create that winning picture.
A perfect analogy. And just like with a puzzle, Building a successful fantasy team takes time, patience, and a good dose of strategy.
Couldn't have said it better myself. All right, folks, we've covered a lot of ground today, analyzing those Game Week 14 highlights, checking out those standout performances, and getting a glimpse of what Game Week 15 has in store for us.
Yeah, lots to think about. The key takeaway here is to stay curious, stay informed, and always try to be one step ahead of the game.
Absolutely. But before we let you go, we want to leave you with a final thought, something to ponder as you head into Game Week 15. We've seen how injuries can really shake things up, so think about this.
Yeah.
How are you approaching bench depth for the rest of the season? Are you prioritizing those reliable backups, or are you rolling the dice with those high upside but maybe a little riskier players?
Yeah, it's a question that all fantasy managers should be asking themselves. There's no right or wrong answer, really. It's all about your personal risk tolerance and how you want to approach the game overall.
Right, finding that balance between playing it safe and going for those big swings. It's what makes fantasy football so engaging.
Absolutely. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I just want to give a quick shout out to some of our other listeners who've been absolutely crushing it this season. Silliman, Barhoma, Rad, Andrew Boutros, and Mocha G. You guys are killing it out there. Keep up the great work.
Yeah, big ups to all of them. It's inspiring to see so much passion and dedication in the fantasy football community.
It really is. And to all our listeners out there, whether you're a seasoned veteran or you're just starting out on your fantasy football journey, remember, it's all about having fun and enjoying the beautiful game.
Couldn't agree more. So as we head into Game Week 15, let's all embrace the challenge, the triumphs, the heartbreaks, everything that comes with this amazing game.
Well said. And remember, folks, stay curious, stay informed, and may your fantasy teams reign supreme.
That's all for this week's Deep Dive. We'll be back next week with more insights, more analysis, and more fantasy football fun. Until then, keep those lineups strong and those points rolling in.